All right. So thank you all for coming on this this very hot July day. I want to especially thank Jason Bordoff. I'll say more about him in a moment, but let me not forget to thank Roger Hertog and the Hertog Foundation for making all of this possible. I think that that Professor Bordoff really exemplifies what the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative is all about, in that we're interested in creating new knowledge and making discoveries about challenges that are transnational in nature and global in scope, but not just knowledge for its own sake, but instead knowledge that might actually help us grapple with these kinds of challenges. So it's really a pleasure to welcome him here tonight, and more generally to welcome him to Columbia. He joined the Columbia community in January of 2013. He's now the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy for the School of International and Public Affairs. So he's really playing a key role in what's becoming a very important strength at the school and Columbia more generally. And he joins us after having served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change on the staff of the National Security Council. Before that, he'd served as Policy Director for the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. Before then, he was a member of the Clinton administration. Just in terms of his own background as a scholar and as a student, he graduated from Brown and went on to Harvard. He had a Marshall Scholarship and studied at Oxford in Middle East Policy, or Middle East Studies rather. But just on a more kind of personal and local note, I think many of us have a special reason to feel thankful to Professor Bordoff, because after all, he was a key member of the team that coordinated the response to Hurricane Sandy. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, so I guess it's fitting that he was played such a critical role in ensuring adequate fuel supplies and energy infrastructure in this region when it was still reeling under the impact of Hurricane Sandy. So we have many reasons to thank him, so I hope you'll join me in giving him a round of applause. So thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. Thanks to the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative and to the lecture series for inviting me to take part. It's a really great lineup of people that everyone will be hearing from this summer, so I'm honored to be a part of it. I was fortunate that I didn't have to leave the building to travel from my office to come here, so for those of you who had to go outside, special thank you. If I were still in government and you were trying to sort of like stagecraft a speech on climate change, we would have done this outside, and I would have worn really heavy clothing, so I'd be sweating, and so it's an appropriate day to sort of talk about the challenges of climate change given what it's like outside. And I appreciate your kind introduction, and sort of happy to talk about the slides, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the American energy landscape, but then also happy to talk in the Q&A about the last 4 years, about my time in government. As you heard, I sort of, one of the experience of Hurricane Sandy was one of the more challenging and interesting things I got to work on, and grew up in New York, as you heard, so special meaning to be able to help make sure that this area could be resilient and respond. And my dad actually owned a gas station in Brooklyn, as did my grandfather before him. So I remember I don't remember very well personally, but heard about lines at the gas station, which no one in this region saw again until we had to deal with it while I was in government. Anyway, so what I wanted to talk about a little bit, so I'm supposed to press is it this button that goes up and down? Is there a keyboard? Oh, there's a keyboard here. Got it. Okay. Is to provide a little bit of a discussion of how the energy landscape is changing in North America and what that means for climate change, both domestically and globally. And so that's what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about. We have a lot of time. An hour and a half is kind of a long period of time. Nobody really wants to hear me speak for that long, so I won't speak for too long. But then hopefully we can leave a lot of time for discussion. So that's sort of the overview, how the energy landscape is changing, and how do we think about the climate impacts both here and abroad. To start, let me talk a little bit about the really dramatic transformation that we have seen in the North American energy landscape in really just a very small period of time. I think when the next Dan Yergin writes the next book on energy history, decades from now, we're going to look back at this moment that we're going through right now as one of the really transformational moments in our energy history, given the new technologies that have come online that have unleashed the ability to extract oil and gas in particular from in ways that we couldn't have done from before. And what that has led to in the U.S. is a real shift in the outlook from one of scarcity to one of abundance. And often people talk about shale gas. That's a particularly timely and controversial issue here in New York State, given the policy toward shale gas extraction that the state has. But this is about oil too, and so the same technologies that are being used to unleash shale gas revolution are leading to a dramatic increase in oil production in the U.S. We're going to mostly talk about the climate impacts. I just wanted to note that this has significant economic and geopolitical impacts, and I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A too. So we're going to see increased GDP activity, increased economic activity, an improvement in our trade balance. Billions of dollars in manufacturing reinvestment is coming back to the U.S. in response to low natural gas prices, and particularly the difference between natural gas prices here and natural gas prices elsewhere in the world, or even more importantly, the difference between natural gas prices here and naphtha, which is oil-based, and that's the feedstock they're using for manufacturing in other parts of the world. We could have a whole nother lecture series on the geostrategic impacts of the North American energy boom. When I was in government, worked quite a bit on our policy to sanction Iran and pull 1.5 million barrels a day of Iranian oil off the market. I think our ability to do that in a way that imposed pain on Iran without imposing pain on ourselves by driving up oil prices was made much easier by the fact that the U.S. oil production is up 2 million barrels a day over the last 3 years roughly. And so I think it's also had an impact in Russia's leverage in Europe. We've seen Russia traditionally have a monopoly stranglehold on selling natural gas into Europe and be able to control the prices that European countries paid. All the natural gas, liquefied natural gas capacity that countries like Qatar built up to supply the U.S. market, all of that has sort of flipped on its head now, because we don't need that gas, so all those supplies are flowing into the European market. They're creating more competition for gas, driving down prices, and that's putting a lot of pressure on Russia. We're going to see exports of energy from the U.S., particularly natural gas, which is allowed. I don't want to say allowed, it's automatically allowed to countries with which you have a free trade agreement, but you need permission from the government to export to countries with which we do not have a free trade agreement. That's playing into our trade negotiations now, like the EU, the free trade agreement being negotiated with the EU, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And obviously this has important implications for OPEC's role in the world, as we see the largest increases in production now coming from non-OPEC countries. So it's always helpful to see things visually, at least for me. This is just a little bit of a helpful visual image about how dramatically the North American energy outlook has changed. So you can see from the left is the annual energy outlook in 2005. That's the Energy Information Administration's sort of baseline reference forecast. And you can see there the projections for how much natural gas the U.S. was projected to need to import to meet domestic demand. And nearly all of that growth was coming in the form of very costly liquefied natural gas, which is the red part of the bar. The outlook today is entirely different. We have completely eliminated the need to import LNG. We are dramatically reducing the need to import any pipeline gas at all, and the U.S. will soon be a net exporter of natural gas. So this is a really dramatic outlook, change in the outlook. And I'll show you the prices in a minute. Prices have also dramatically changed, and that's had an important economic effect. As I said, this isn't only about natural gas. This is about oil too. So again, here I compared the annual energy outlook 2005 and the annual energy outlook 2013, the most recent one, and you can see how the outlook has changed. U.S. net oil imports, the amount of oil we were projected just 8 years ago to need to import was 12 million barrels a day higher than in 2025 than we now project it will need to be to meet U.S. demand. That's a really staggering change. You can see on the right-hand part of the slide, that's not just because of increased U.S. production, that's also because of reduced consumption, because of higher prices, because of geographic shifts, because of policy changes like doubling of fuel economy standards, which the administration put in place, but also because we're producing a lot more liquid fuel in the United States. U.S. oil production was up 1 million barrels a day year on year. From 2012 to 2011, the U.S. just passed Saudi Arabia as the world's largest producer of liquid fuels, and by 2017 or 18 is projected to pass it in crude oil production. So really a staggering change in the outlook for oil production in the U.S. This is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is a North American phenomenon too. And so here you can see the projections in blue for Canada. And that's largely the oil sands, and this is the projection for how much oil production in Canada will grow. You can see the projections in the U.S. are to continue growing, but then taper off. There's a lot of uncertainty about the decline rates and the recovery rates of some of these unconventional tight oil wells. So some people think EIA is being too conservative here, or IEA, I'm sorry, is being too conservative. And if you look at a lot of the private sector forecasts, they also think that, and we've seen costs coming down, technologies continuing to improve, and that this boom could continue for a while. I don't think we'll see the same growth rates we've seen in the last 2 years. That would be hard to sustain, but that they could continue for a bit more. So I want to talk a little bit about what this means, a dramatic increase in hydrocarbon productions in North America. And I'll walk through a couple of points. U.S. emissions are down. They're down to levels we haven't seen in about almost 20 years. The major driver was an economic downturn, but after that, cheap natural gas was the largest reason why we've had emissions decline in the last couple of years. But I want to make a few points, and maybe the most important is that there are some, you hear some people sort of say that we've solved our climate problem because we have a lot of cheap natural gas and it's displacing coal, and I don't believe that is correct. So a lot of inexpensive natural gas, I believe, can be helpful and lower the cost of implementing climate policy. But ultimately, we need policy. We need a cap on carbon. We need a price on carbon. We need some policy to help drive our emissions reduction. And we can talk about what role a large supply of natural gas can play in that. And then we also should talk about when people sort of say we're in a abundance of shale gas world, the same technology that gives you shale gas gives you tight oil. And so you can't get one without the other. And we sort of need to think about, on the whole, how those things net out and what they mean for greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously the issue of fugitive methane emissions is one that is getting a lot of attention, is very important. Organizations like Environmental Defense Fund are doing some really important work on. So, U.S. emissions down 12% since 2005. As I said, the primary reason is an economic downturn, but after that, inexpensive natural gas is probably the biggest factor. So this shows you in blue U.S. natural gas prices. You can see a couple of years ago they fell off a cliff. They peaked over near $13 per million BTU in 2008. They dropped to about $1.93 in the spring of last year, I think, and they're about $3.60 about now, I think, maybe a little bit higher. Another important phenomenon, which we should talk about in terms of the geostrategic impacts, but also the environmental impacts and the potential for gas to coal switching, coal to gas switching in other parts of the world, is the price of natural gas in other parts of the world. And so historically, the price of natural gas around the world has been pretty similar. A couple of years ago, that relationship completely broke apart. And so you can see here, the price of natural gas in Asia is the green line. It's around $16, $17 per million BTU, about 4 or 5 times as high as it is here. And in Europe, it's about $9 or $10, or maybe even a little bit higher per million BTU. So very inexpensive natural gas in the US. One thing I want to point out to you is it's not as expensive today as it was about a year ago. So if you look just before the red line at, I don't have a pointer, but just before the red line, you can see US gas prices are starting to come back up. And so I'll come back to that impact in a minute. So inexpensive markets respond to price changes as we expect they might. And so what we've seen is the US electricity sector has seen declining carbon emissions due to fuel switching. 2005 to 2012, sharp shift away from coal, a sharp increase in the use of natural gas. Natural gas is about half as carbon intensive as coal, and we should talk about fugitive methane emissions and whether we think those are right, but let's assume for the moment that's true. And so the way greenhouse gas emissions are calculated, we see a sharp reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and also an increase in renewables, and I don't want to discount that. Particularly the rapid deployment of wind, which is zero carbon, not just half as carbon, so gets you much bigger bang for the buck when you can do it. We've had a big build out of wind, and that was also really an important driver of the emissions decline. You can see here that coal lost market share in response to cheap natural gas. For the first time, the amount of electricity we get from the amount of electricity we get from natural gas equaled the amount that we get from coal. About 33% of our electricity came from both. But I pointed out to you a few slides ago, the price of natural gas is going back up. And so the market is responding, and so coal is regaining its market share. I think that's important to this story about, we're seeing a reduction in emissions. We're 12% below 2005. We're on our trajectory. We're on our path to meet our 17% by 2020 international commitment. That may not be the case. I suspect that this year U.S. carbon emissions will go up. Natural gas prices are not going to stay at $1.93, and we're already seeing coal regaining market share, natural gas losing market share. So this is a reminder that climate policy is ultimately still going to be what's necessary to achieve our emission reduction targets. The Energy Information Administration provides different scenarios. So they have their reference case, which is what people sort of think of as the baseline, and this shows U.S. carbon emissions this is total U.S. emissions from energy-related CO2. The blue line is the reference case, so that's what people think is going to happen. The EIA models what will happen if we have a lot more shale gas and oil than we think we're going to, or a lot less shale gas and oil than we think we're going to. And you can see in the high resource case, if we have a lot more shale gas and oil than we think we're going to, emissions actually go down. Now you should look at the scale, so this is not zero, right? So as a percentage, it's still a pretty small decline. But because of coal to gas switching, a large amount, it's a reminder that a large amount of inexpensive natural gas can help for a period of time reduce emissions. It doesn't get you to 17%, certainly not 80% or reduction, but it helps lower emissions. And that's because the cheapest, we know from modeling of a carbon price that the cheapest emissions to find in the economy, you start with energy efficiency and you start by moving away from some of the oldest, most inefficient coal plants. And low natural gas prices helps provide the economic incentive to do that. So I said we should obviously think about fugitive methane emissions. That's getting a lot of attention. The EPA provides an inventory of fugitive methane emissions from natural gas systems. There's a lot of variation in the numbers. They have changed. The most recent estimates from EPA actually revised downward significantly how much methane they think leaks from the natural gas system. But there's some uncertainty about that. I think we need the short answer is we need better information. We need better research and data on this. Based on what we know today, there's not a huge difference with one or two outliers, and I can talk about some of the assumptions that went into those studies and why they're outliers. But for most of the studies, there's not a huge difference between the amount of emissions that come from conventional versus unconventional being shale, and most estimates still fall within the range of about a 40 to 50% lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for electricity that's generated from natural gas rather than coal. I still think it's probably safe to assume that something in that range is correct, but as I said, some organizations like Environmental Defense Fund are doing really important work to give us better data because we just don't have enough good information to really know if in fact that's correct. But I think for the purpose of discussing energy issues now until people answer those questions, that's probably a useful starting point and to think about. So let me talk a little bit now about how to think about the global impacts of carbon. So, I mean, the takeaway from all of that, I think, is that a large supply of low-priced natural gas helps economically, it helps geopolitically, and it provides it can provide some climate benefits too. There are other environmental impacts aside from climate, and we need to make sure it's done safely. We need to make sure drinking water is protected. There are a host of issues associated with unconventional shale production, but it can help lower emissions. But it's not going to have a huge impact. And over time, as prices go up, coal's going to regain some market share. A a lot of economic modeling shows that in response to a climate policy like cap and trade or a carbon tax, a large supply of low-price gas makes it cheaper for you to achieve your target, your emissions cap. And so that is probably the most helpful thing that the shale boom can do. We need climate policy. We need serious carbon legislation. It can help make it lower. It can help lower the cost of implementing that legislation and meeting our carbon target. Globally, the world is very far from where it needs to be to deal seriously with carbon emissions and climate change and avoid the worst impacts. I think we all know that. The growth of emissions is coming not from the US or from the EU, it's coming from non-OECD countries, particularly China. An important thing to keep in mind is when I talk about taking climate change seriously, passing meaningful carbon legislation today, like cap and trade or a carbon tax, those emissions occur gradually over a period of time if you try to put in place a cost-effective policy. And so if you look at the International Energy Agency's modeling of a scenario where we achieve our 450 part per million target that provides a 50-50 chance of hitting our globally agreed 2 degrees Celsius increase target, in that model, in 2035, the share of our energy that comes from fossil fuels goes from 81% to 63%. So that's a sharp reduction. But fossil fuels, even if we take climate change seriously, will continue to provide a significant portion of the world's energy for a while, decades to come. And so I think that's important, and they're not all created equal, and obviously the emissions from coal are different from those from gas. So I think that's important when we think about the shale revolution in the US, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, the multiple objectives we have of dealing with climate change, but also promoting economic growth and providing low-cost energy to people and dealing with some geopolitical goals that we have. And so I think we need to balance all of those things when we think about what it means that the U.S. can significantly increase its oil and gas production in the next several decades, and whether that's consistent with putting in place meaningful climate policy that reduces our emissions over a long period of time. Energy efficiency and inefficient coal, as I said, are some of the lowest hanging fruit, some of the cheapest ways that we could reduce emissions. And I'll talk about an IEA study that just came out that was quite helpful in reminding us of that. I mentioned already that lower cost natural gas can help reduce emissions, also local pollution. I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, and they certainly care a lot about local pollution as well as carbon emissions. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of increasing U.S. shale, the potential likelihood, I think, of U.S. natural gas exports and what increasing global gas trade and U.S. exports of natural gas might mean for global carbon emissions and the consumption of coal in other parts of the world. So just a little bit of data to kind of get us, set the context, right? The energy demand growth is not coming from us, it's coming from non-OECD, particularly China. You can see where in the energy sector this energy demand is projected to come from. Biggest growth is coming in power generation. If you look at energy demand by fuel, natural gas, by far the largest growing sector is renewables. Renewables have a much faster growth rate than any other form of energy. The problem is that a 40% increase in renewable production still is dwarfed by just a couple of percent increase in coal because it's coming off such a small base. So renewable grows the most quickly. You can also see natural gas grows quite quickly as well. And as a result of that, this is all reference case, assuming no policy changes. This is what happens to global greenhouse gas emissions over time. They keep going up, although the rate does slow a little bit relative to what it was earlier. CO2 emissions are still going up. They went up last year. We're still headed in the wrong direction, but not all countries are in the same boat. And so you can see here what's happened in China versus what's happened in the United States. The European Union has also seen a decline, but it was steeper in the U.S., even though Europe has a cap and trade system and the U.S. doesn't. But again, that was economics and natural gas and partly renewables. This also compares U.S. versus China in terms of this is the annual change in emissions over time. So you can see every year Chinese emissions are going up. They're going up. There's not a clear trend, but they went up in 2012 less than they did the year before. In the U.S., they had been going up, and now generally they are going down. I think this bar will be positive in 2013, but we'll see. And then over the last decade, they've gone down in the U.S. a little bit, but that's been dwarfed by the extent to which they've gone up in China. And again, greenhouse gas is a global pollutant. We don't really care where it comes from, so it's effective. It has the same impact wherever that emissions come from. This is country-level energy-related CO2 emissions. So again, the story here is China. India also has a sharp increase. The Middle East grows sharply. United States, declining emissions. Japan, declining emissions. The European Union, declining emissions. But if we think about where the emissions growth is going to come from, we need to focus on the Chinese economy. And so this is the point I made before. What I did here was I sort of took the new policy scenario. So that's the reference case for the International Energy Agency. So the dotted line is kind of the same as what I just showed you before. If things stay the way they're headed now, this is where people think the world is headed. Oil demand will taper off but still grow. We could talk about why oil demand is slowing. In the US, it's going down. Natural gas demand will grow sharply. Coal demand will grow, but then plateau and flatten out. And you can see other forms of energy grow, but gradually. The solid line is what happens if you model meeting a 450 part per million scenario, according to the IEA, and again, in the most economic way. So they assume that the market responds so we get the cheapest reductions. And there you can see coal sharply declines. Oil plateaus and then starts to decline. Natural gas keeps going up. It doesn't go up as sharply. But natural gas is the only fossil fuel where if we meet our 2-degree target, we use more natural gas in 2035 than we do today. And then you can see, obviously, renewables and nuclear go up much more sharply. But again, the point here is even if we are on track to meet the 2-degree target, we're still going to be talking about the use of fossil fuels for a while and thinking about where they come from and how to do so in the most economic way, and why the increased production of oil, particularly oil and gas, and that's, you see here, coal responds differently than oil and gas for a reason in terms of their carbon content. The increased use of oil, production of oil and gas in the US and a reduction in imports, it's something to keep in mind when you think about whether that's consistent with putting in place meaningful climate policy today that has an impact over a longer period of time. I mentioned before that the International Energy Agency had just done a study of climate change, which I think is really, I would commend to you, and was really good. And what they tried to do was not just remind us that we're on the wrong trajectory, we're headed toward an unsustainable path, which we know, but it's helpful to see their data. But they also made a concrete recommendation to say, we know that the global international community is not taking the steps it needs to take. It needs to take much more aggressive measures to really put us on a sustainable trajectory. Soon we may lose the ability to get on that path, or it may become much more costly. So are there low-cost, easier things to do today that don't solve the problem, but kind of keep the option open of really getting serious about climate change and keep us on a more sustainable path, so that it makes it easier if in 2020 the international community decides to take much more meaningful action than it's done in the past. And so they they make 4 recommendations for policies that would sort of, they call them 4 for 2, because it's sort of 4 policies, all of which are no cost or negative cost, that keep the 2-degree option open and keep us on that 450 part per million path. First, and the most important, is energy efficiency. So, economists tend to think there's not a lot of free money lying on the floor. If something was economic, people would have done it. If you could save money, you would have done it. But of course, we know that's not true. Lots of us may have the air conditioning running in our home right now, even though it's 97 degrees and we're not home. And there are a huge number of opportunities to increase energy efficiency and save people money. So do it at negative cost, that for a variety of reasons we can go into are not being picked up today. So that's the biggest thing. The second biggest piece of their pie was to limit the use of inefficient coal plants, both in the US and around the world. Many parts of the world are rapidly building out new coal capacity. In the US, we have a fairly old, often inefficient fleet, and there are relatively economic opportunities to transition away from that toward other fuels, including in the near term natural gas. Dealing with methane emissions from upstream oil and gas. So whatever, I said before that we think it's still roughly half as carbon intensive, and IEA doesn't disagree with that. Whatever that answer is, there's still opportunities for improvement. Methane is a potent, in the near, with a shorter lifespan, greenhouse gas, and so there are some low-cost opportunities to reduce that. And then the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. So many of the largest producers of energy around the world, Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, subsidize fossil fuel prices in their countries. That increases consumption, and if you were to remove fossil fuel subsidies, you would see a reduction in fossil fuel use and in emissions. So I want to talk a little bit about the retirement of the coal, the piece of that pie that was about the most about using less coal, and particularly talk a little bit just for a minute about the role that natural gas can play in that. This is where Chinese power generation is headed according to current projections. So you can see that natural gas grows a lot, but everything in China is dwarfed by the use of coal. That's true today, and it will be more true looking out into the future. So the question is, what could change that? What could bend that curve, which is really important not just for carbon emissions, but also for local pollution. So you can see what the air quality in Beijing looks like. This is the PM 2.5 concentration in Beijing. I think it's an average for 2012 relative to other main U.S. cities. And I was fortunate when I was there 2 weeks ago. It wasn't terrible, but it can be. So they have lots of reasons why they'd prefer to use. And natural gas relative to coal, in terms of criteria pollutant, is about 17 times worse. So it's just, it's a totally different thing. It's not the same as climate change. It is much better for air pollution than coal. I want to talk a little bit about I showed you earlier why natural gas is so expensive in the Pacific Rim, $16 or $17, and in the US it's below $4. So you don't have a lot of incentive to switch away from coal and use natural gas. So I want to talk a little bit about what the reason for that is and what might change that. This shows you where the Asia-Pacific region gets its natural gas. How much of it comes from pipeline and how much comes it from LNG. LNG is much more costly because of the cost of liquefaction and transportation. But unlike pipelines, which are from point A to point B and very capital intensive to create and typically have long-term contracts associated with them, LNG ships can move around a little more freely, although you need a place to offload them, which is not easy. You can see here where the growth is coming from in Asian country natural gas demand, and again, the story here is China. You can see in the near term, the growth is mostly in Chinese LNG imports, and then in the out years, much more in Chinese production, because people think probably in about 10 to 20 years, China's going to figure out how to do shale gas the way we have, but that's going to take some time for them to get there. And the reason is because they have the largest shale gas reserves in the world. I won't go into these slides too much, but the point here is that exports of natural gas are increasing a lot from some parts of the world, like Australia, like Russia. Imports of natural gas and North America. And imports, both pipeline and LNG, are increasing a lot in China, also in Japan. And this is complicated, but the point is just that the arrows for natural gas trade flows are going increasingly into Asia and increasingly out of Russia, North America, and other places. So this is where the LNG flows are headed. And the question is, what could change the way they price their natural gas? So they're not paying $16 or $17 anymore, and it may become more economic to use natural gas rather than coal. The big debate now is whether the U.S. should export natural gas. That's a policy issue that's live in Washington, D.C. This is a projection for if the U.S. were to allow natural gas exports, how much is likely to be economic and likely to happen, and it sort of falls in the 5 or 6 BCF a day range. So you ask, how big a difference would 4 or 5 BCF a day of natural gas exports make? Well, this shows you how much, how the gas that different regions buy is priced. So in Europe, for a long time, they were buying natural gas that was linked to the price of oil, which makes natural gas very expensive. More and more, they're buying it on a spot basis, which makes it lower priced and more competitive. And this year, it'll be about half and half. In the Asia-Pacific region, they're still buying most of their natural gas in long-term oil-linked contracts, not on a spot basis. If you were to send 4 or 5 BCF a day of natural gas from the U.S. into the Asia-Pacific region, indexed to cheap Henry Hub prices of $3.60 or $4 or even $5, and think about what that would mean for the creation, for liquidity in the market, and the ability to have price formation and actually have create a spot market that would create more competition and bring down the price of natural gas in Asia, I think the impact could potentially be significant. And this again just shows what, relative to the scale of what they're importing today, how much U.S. LNG would contribute. And so I went on this diversion on natural gas because we try to think about what policies in the near to medium term could put China in particular, but other Pacific Rim countries too, on a different trajectory in terms of their coal consumption. The option to provide that region of the world with much more natural gas and at significantly lower prices, I think is significant. 2 years ago, the International Energy Agency did a study what they call the golden age of gas scenario. So they sort of assumed that lots of increased natural gas supply was coming online at much lower prices, and they modeled what that would do to a reduction in carbon emissions. You can see it lowers it, not a huge amount, but it lowers it a little bit, and there are some reasons why it's not larger. It's not that inconsistent with the numbers I showed you before for the U.S. scenario. Remember, the scale on the left was not 0, so it was only 2%. But an increased supply, and these are a little bit old, and I think they'd probably be a little bit higher if you were to do it today, but this doesn't account for a significant change in price formation, a significant way in the way the natural gas is priced in the Asia-Pacific region. So again, the takeaway from that is that natural gas can, I think, play, the U.S. shale gas boom in particular, can play a role in helping reduce emissions in the U.S. and overseas. But it doesn't solve our problem. It only gets us so far. What it can help really do is lower the cost of implementing climate policy. But climate policy is still the key, and that's what's needed to deal seriously with carbon emissions. So, as I said, sort of takeaways from all of this. The U.S. energy landscape is changing dramatically, really transformationally. A large supply of cheap natural gas has helped, but policy is still needed. Fossil fuels, even with serious climate policy, still power our global economy for decades to come. I think the question then is sort of, if that's true, what does that mean for how we can work together to really build support for meaningful climate policy, like the kind, it could be cap and trade, it could be carbon tax, or the kind that President Obama announced a few weeks ago in his speech to use the Clean Air Act to deal with emissions from existing power plants. And so the question is whether we have an opportunity now to increase unconventional oil and gas production in the U.S. There are things that industry may find helpful in order to help realize that potential, increase economic activity here, lower our reliance on imports, exports of energy, expedited permitting of pipelines, loosening of the Jones Act. There are things that one might do that would help realize the potential for unconventional energy production in the U.S., but say, in return, we want to make sure that we're putting in place today policies that put us on a long-term sustainable path to reduce carbon emissions. And first, that's going to come from efficiency in coal. Over time, it may come from other fossil fuels. Maybe carbon capture and storage really deploys in a way that's more economic. We don't know yet. And say we want, in exchange for things that help us realize our unconventional energy potential today, we want industry to support meaningful climate policy that we start to take quickly, first through administrative action, if that's what's possible, and then eventually through legislative action to put a price on carbon. That's in the U.S. Globally, carbon, greenhouse gases are a global pollutant, so it doesn't really matter where they come from. Growth is driven by non-OECD, especially China, and so we need to make sure that we're working with the Chinese, among other countries, but I point them out in particular, to reduce emissions. We can help do that by lowering the price of lower carbon forms of energy in the Pacific Rim. We can do that through bilateral relations like the HFC deal that was just announced between the U.S. and China a few weeks ago. And that's why, and again, increased natural gas trade and competition, I think, can play a role in helping provide some alternatives for the non-OECD countries in the near term. In short, this is just like one of my favorite cartoons, so it's always good to end with a cartoon. These issues are complicated. There's no one solution to deal with all of these things, and I sort of like the T-shirt being worn by the donkey, which says, increase domestic production, improve fuel efficiency, invest in clean energy alternatives, and reduce oil imports by 1/3, baby, which maybe is not the best slogan, but it may be the right policy. And sometimes those two things are not the same, and so we can talk about whether political constraints and communication play a role in making it more difficult to put first best policies in place too. So thanks for having me.
Jim Fleming is going to join us now for the Q&A. Let me just, if I could ask you something. I've always been, as somebody who doesn't work in energy, doesn't have your experience either, in terms of the research or in policy, but still, just as a citizen, I've grown up, listening to politicians talk about energy security for decades now, and I've never understood that concept. I mean, even now, even when we're getting to the point where the U.S., is potentially going to become an oil exporter, we're going to produce more oil than Saudi Arabia and so on. so long as we're participating in global markets, and so long as you pointed out in your own writings, the infrastructure has been set up in such a way so as to ensure that we're going to be participating in global markets because of the way our refineries are built, where they're located, and so on. What does energy security even mean? So could you help me with that? I mean, is it more than a political concept? Does it actually have some substantive meaning that we can understand?
I think it's a really good question, and it is both. I do think there is a substantive meaning to it, but it does have political connotations. I don't like using the term energy independence. I'm not really sure what it means. As you said, we are in a global market, so even if the U.S. imported no oil at all, if the Strait of Hormuz was closed tomorrow or mined or something, and oil prices shot up $50 a barrel, that would affect consumers in the U.S. just as much as if we imported olive oil, because oil prices are set for the most part in a global market. And to be clear, a lot of people sort of hear some of the data I just talked about, and then say things like the U.S. is going to not import oil, or is going to be an oil. I mean, you said we'll be an oil exporter. We won't be a net oil exporter. We export some oil today, about 130,000 barrels a day. There will be increased pressure for the U.S. to export oil of the kind we're producing in the U.S., light sweet oil, because our refineries prefer heavy sour oil. But we're going to be importing on net oil as far as the eye can see. But again, the question is, does that even matter relative to your security? And our exposure to the global oil economy is largely the same from a price standpoint, whether we import a lot or import a little. I think your exposure to the global oil economy really depends on how much you consume. So if we consume, the same amount of oil, but our import level changes, our prices go up for consumers just as much. There are benefits to increasing domestic production, increased economic activity, a reduction in our trade balance. The impact of an oil price spike on GDP is probably lower if we import, even though the price impact is the same, if we import very little oil, more of that revenue is staying within the U.S. economy. So it's a transfer issue from consumers to producers, but the GDP impact may be smaller. In terms of security, the question is sort of security of supply. So, are we worried about we have a strategic petroleum reserve of 700 million barrels of oil sitting on the Gulf Coast in salt caverns, and it was built because we thought we might get cut off, that countries in the Middle East would stop sending us oil. And that was at a time when oil was not traded as a global commodity, and every second on Wall Street, the way it is today, it was at a time when oil was sold in long-term 20-year contracts. But those things don't exist today. So if there's some disruption somewhere, prices respond. And so I think that's why we should think about exactly what our security risk is. Natural gas markets are different because, as I showed, there isn't a global price. I don't think there'll be a global price for natural gas for a while. But when we think about security, I do think there are benefits to increasing domestic production, but fundamentally you're right, it's a global market, and you need to think about it that way and reduce consumption. Reducing consumption increases your security and reduces your vulnerability to price spikes.
I guess just to finish the thought, it reduces your exposure to the economic dislocation you would have from price shocks. Is that right? I mean, if the consumption is less.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because you're less of your economy is less exposed, less of it's being spent on energy. Right.
Right. Okay. Well, the floor is open. I have lots of questions, but you probably don't want to hear all of them. Over to you, Gabe.
Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your talk. But I suppose one of the things that I really noticed about your talk was that it was heavily it had a lot of graphs. It had a lot of kind of aggregate statistics. And if I wanted to get a broad kind of global picture of what's going on, in particularly the United States, I would come to you. But if I was kind of a grassroots environmentalist, these are the exact things that I would want to avoid in order for people to become inspired to kind of change their habits of consumption, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess two questions comes out of that. One, where do people consume the most energy in terms of kind of, if you were to create an itemized list of the top 5 things, where would the top 5 things be? And number two, if I was a kind of grassroots, organizer for people, how could I convince people outside of these graphs to actually make any meaningful changes to those consumption habits?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's a great It's a great book by Gurno Wagner, who's an adjunct professor here at SEPA and works at Environmental Defense Fund, called "But Will the Planet Notice?" And his basic point is you don't use plastic bags, you use like a reusable bag, and you don't use paper cups, you use like a reusable cup, and you do all these things, and does it matter? And he sort of put some numbers around it to show on the whole, we don't want to discourage anyone from doing these things, but this is not where carbon emissions are coming from in the global economy, right? How much of them are coming from industrial uses, industrial applications, transportation sector, driving our cars, air travel, things that are very carbon intensive that most of us don't see. So the problem is like, carbon emissions they're not things that kind of affect our daily lives. So I'm not saying anyone shouldn't, unplug your chargers because of vampire load, but this is not bending the curve for global carbon emissions. And that's why I think it is, but those are things that do help build support and build action and help the public become more, people feel invested in it if they feel like they're contributing. You want to avoid a sense that there's been some false achievement because that could sort of lower the incentive to actually, push for things that really will make a big difference. And I think what's needed to make a big difference, because carbon emissions are so pervasive throughout the economy, because they come in so many invisible places in the way our goods and products are produced and consumed every day, that's why I think you need policy. I mean, I think this is a role that will only be solved, this is a problem that will only be solved with government putting in place some policy like a cap on carbon emissions. You cannot emit more than X tons of CO2 in a year, and then people sort of figure out how, if we're counting it correctly, how to trade amongst themselves to do that. And that's sort of that's really I think that's really important. But I think you're right. That is like one of the main. It isn't a challenge with this issue, is making sure people feel invested and are really focused on things. You'll hear. You'll hear in 2 weeks, I think, from Bill McKibben, and the public has obviously become incredibly focused on a pipeline to Canada. Whatever one thinks of that pipeline, I think that if people were, I was in D.C. a few days ago and passed a protest of 80 people, and President Obama was in a fundraiser, and they were no Keystone, no Keystone. Whatever you think, yes or no about that, my reaction was, if they were protesting and yelling and getting arrested to say, use the Clean Air Act to limit emissions from coal-fired power plants, the potential gain from a climate standpoint would be so much larger than whether we do or do not build one particular pipeline. That's my own personal view. And sometimes I think we need to make sure that we're focusing on the things that really matter and make the biggest difference for bending the carbon curve.
If you could, come. One thing about coal, though, I mean, what about limiting or in some way putting a cost to U.S. coal exports? Because, I mean, half of the reduction in CO2 emissions has been, you could wipe that out just from the increase in exports of U.S. coal.
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. I think U.S. coal exports will become an increasingly controversial issue. I think the environmental community will they already have, but increasingly focus on that. One important analytic question, which I haven't seen a great piece of work done on, I'd actually like to do it at the center, is whether U.S. coal exports are additional to global consumption. So, are U.S. coal exports changing the global price of coal such that they are increasing global coal consumption, or at a given price, is China going to consume, supply and demand curves cross at a certain price. At a certain price of coal, China or Europe is going to consume as much coal as it's going to consume, and they're getting it from us instead of Australia. That's just an important piece of analysis that I actually would find interesting, so it would understand the greenhouse gas impact of U.S. coal exports. And I think that the issue with coal exports is, unlike oil exports or natural gas exports, the U.S. actually doesn't, for the most part, have the authority to restrict it. I mean, you don't need a permit to export coal, just like you don't need a permit to export refined petroleum. You need some permits from the U.S. Army Corps to build the facilities to do it, but you don't need permission from the government to actually export. So it is a little bit of an issue. It's a question of how exactly you engage on that issue. But I think it's going to become increasingly controversial.
I'm Robert Page, and I work for Morgan Jones in Beijing. Actually, I work on energy technology. But isn't the simple answer to his question allowing energy prices to rise, which no government is willing to do, whether it's the U.S. government or China? In other words, if you look, energy efficiency is completely incongruent with cheap energy, and we know this. And there's no other solution except to allow or to impose policy that demands that prices rise. And so when you spoke about energy policy, in essence, what you're speaking about is the need for government to mandate through a mechanism that's going to have the effect of having energy prices rise and having the public accept that.
Well, I mean, that's why I said I think the most cost-effective approach to deal with carbon emissions is a price on carbon, whether it's a cap and trade system or carbon tax, but in the end, that affects energy prices and people respond to those incentives. I do think there's a difference economically and distributionally between higher market prices and a government policy like a carbon tax. So higher market prices might have the same effect in terms of consumption. They're more damaging to the economy. They're more regressive in terms of their impact. If you were to have lower market prices and impose a carbon price through government policy, you generate revenue that you could use to offset distributional impacts, help invest in some new technologies that might give people more alternatives. So I do think as an economic matter, it would probably make more sense to do it through government policy rather than just letting market prices rise.
As someone whose interest is in having companies enforce new technologies, I can tell you that the new technologies won't be adopted unless there's expensive energy, because expensive energy drives innovation. The very reason why we're still burning coal is because it's just so cheap and because governments allow it. If you look at a country like Iran, the reason why it's cloaked in pollution is because energy is subsidized. You look at China, Beijing, the reason why it's so absolutely polluted is because energy is subsidized. And even if you look at the silly situation we have in this country, where every time gas goes above $4 or $5 an hour, you have silly T-shirts like the one behind you that say "Drill, baby, drill."
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, when gas goes above $4 a gallon, there's a lot of political angst. There's not actually that much the government can do about it. So the government doesn't kind of somehow bring the price down, but there's a lot of angst about it. But yeah, I think energy prices should reflect the cost of using the energy, the market cost of using the energy, and the social cost of using the energy. And I think if we do that, people will respond on the consumption side. And as you said, producers will respond. I mean, as we were saying earlier, that's part of the reason we've seen this boom in oil and gas production, is because innovative people responded to high oil prices and figured out a new technology to extract oil that wouldn't have been economic if oil was $20, but it is economic when it's 100 and, what is it now, 105, 10? And so you're right, markets respond, and they'll respond with alternatives.
So the wrap-up question is, for someone who's in policy, do you think that in a democracy that government can be strong enough to enforce a policy that is not going to be popular across the board with the population? I mean, government responds to the population, and obviously people care about getting reelected in Congress. So, I mean, it's challenging. We had a problem with sulfur dioxide emissions and acid rain, and we addressed it by creating a cap and trade system that put a price on emissions. In terms of the economic impact, it's not the same as carbon. I mean, greenhouse gas emissions are so much more pervasive throughout the economy. I think if people if there's increased recognition of the cost of climate change, then hopefully there will be increased recognition of the benefit of paying something to reduce those costs. I think hopefully we can do more to help people understand what some of those real costs are, and hopefully when people see events like Hurricane Sandy or something else, but if there's a way to help people understand the actual costs they face, that will hopefully be helpful.
I have a question sort of along those lines, and then I have another question I was thinking of originally. I just read a few days ago that Australia, which had passed a carbon tax, it was last year, the government changed hands, and it was one of the main reasons that they changed hands was specifically around the cap and trade market, and the new person coming in, his first vow is to undo the cap and trade market, which has, so I'm wondering if you know more about Australian politics than I do, if you can comment on the situation.
I don't know what in specific led to that being undone. I mean, we're seeing, in the EU, the debate over whether to allow the cap to be tightened, to allow carbon prices to go up because trading prices are so low, whether some of the subsidies in countries like Spain and elsewhere that have put a real strain on budgets, particularly in this, given what the economic situation is there. The public support for for the question before you, for the public support for, people paying more for energy is challenged, particularly when the economic situation is not good, and so we're seeing a lot of that now. So again, I think I don't have a magic answer about how to build public support for this, except to try to again a couple of things. I mean, I think that helping people understand the cost of climate change, which is hard to do because of the nature of the problem, and it's not direct. It doesn't lend itself to one single sort of event that could be directly tied to it. And then at the same time, why I thought the IEA report was really helpful was because it said it's going to take time before the major emitters are able to come together around meaningful policy. And what are things we can do now that are actually no cost, or even might save people money, that help keep us on the right trajectory? And so I think it's really useful to focus on those things too. I also think I was pleased that the president in his speech a few weeks ago placed as much attention as he did on adaptation and resilience as well as mitigation. And not because we should all be pessimistic and just give up our hands and think we're going to have to adapt, but I do think it's going to be a combination of the two, and I think we'll have to think more seriously about what those policies look like too, because some climate impacts are going to happen at this point, and what we're trying to do is avoid the worst impacts.
And my other question, if I may ask, last week Roger Pilkey was here, and he was asked a question at the end of the question and answer series, actually by Daniel, if you want to chime in. And it was about whether he, the sources of influencing the climate policy or energy policy debate in Washington, D.C., empirically, who are the people making decisions. And it was a long back and forth exchange, but at the end he said that he doesn't think that among the sort of tribe of people who care deeply about energy policy and are in the current administration, that people from the Heritage Institution Foundation or any of the sort of free market ideologues who oppose the idea of a cap and trade policy, or corporations that have interests against market any price on carbon, that they don't actually have. He said that he doesn't think they have any influence in the debate. I'm wondering, would you say the same thing? That was very surprising to me, to say that they don't have any influence at all. But
that who doesn't have influence?
The Heritage Institution and the Heritage Foundation and the people, them and the pretty much the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to. I don't know. It's hard to say if any one particular institution has influence or not. I mean, I think people have influence if their analysis is taken seriously, and if people think it's high quality. And that could be conservative. It could be liberal. And I can point to institutions that are both very conservative and very liberal, where I think they do really good analysis. And you dig down and you try to understand why they reach different conclusions. So, and obviously there's a political component, and people in certain environmental groups, get a lot of attention because they're able to generate a lot of activism among their members. There are certain industry groups that are well funded, and they fund campaigns, and they try to gin people up, and sometimes they're using truthful information, sometimes maybe they're not. So it's hard to say with any one organization, but I think in the end, in terms of think tanks and analysis and stuff like that, the work sort of falls or stands on the quality of the work. That was generally my experience.
Okay. So, I mean, money doesn't shape the process? You mentioned,
No,
some
but I
are
don't
better
think-
funded than others. But
Yeah, but that's industry. So what I'm saying
Yeah.
is it's not that the Heritage Foundation or some think tank that's producing, I'm not saying they are, but some think tank that's producing left-wing or right-wing shoddy work. It's not a question of money. It's not like they're buying influence. Maybe they're well-funded and they're producing shoddy work. In terms of money, I mean, money obviously plays a role. I can't pretend it doesn't. And it allows you to buy airtime and television commercials and campaign, and we've seen a history, in the climate change movement of some people from industry trying to fund research that is not supported by good science. So, there's lots of campaigns that industry undertakes. Sometimes they're fine. Sometimes they're, I don't like. I think they're not. I think they're not being truthful. But it depends, and not just in energy. I mean, healthcare debate. I mean, all this stuff. That's true in everything. So, but obviously money plays a role, and campaign contributions are important, and money is important to help make your impact on the political debate.
I think just like, to capture what I thought Roger was trying to say is that it's if you look at where the demand is going to be and where increased CO2 emissions are going to take place, it's not really American oil companies and the research that they fund that's driving it. It's really it's actually state-owned oil companies. It's a big world out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, beyond the kind of arguments that we have in this country. I think that's what he was trying to get at. But anyway, Daniel, since you were the interlocutor in that exchange.
Actually, I want to ask a different kind of question, somewhat related. I mean, unless you want to keep going.
No,
on
that's fine.
Heartland Institute or whatever. Right. I just want to ask about this issue of what would it take in a democracy to pass the kind of climate policy you're talking about, and it seems like it seems from the ways that we're talking about this that distributional issues, like what we're calling distributional issues, should be talked about much more, should be placed at the center. Like in other words. Obviously the wealthiest Americans can afford to pay a higher price of gas, and it seems like there is a popular suspicion that environmentalism is really like an elite person's concern that to some extent would be justified if the price of basic goods goes up. Obviously, if the world price of energy goes up, everything in Walmart will double in price since it's all made with, powered by Chinese coal, and the emissions could really be attributed to us. So, I guess I'm wondering, how much in Washington. How many people are trying to put that distributional issue really at the forefront and saying something even, there are schemes like basically rationing schemes for energy that have been proposed. Are people talking about this? And if not, do you think it's important to bring this distributional issue to the forefront? And if so, how would you do it?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. It is talked about, though probably not as much as it should be. I think there are proposals out there. When you sort of talk about climate policy, like cap and trade or a carbon system, a carbon tax, and there's some perception among some that what this does is raise the money you need to solve climate change, which is not how I think about it. What I think about it is that is the climate change policy, and so if you have a cap on carbon emissions and you auction off permits, the cap is the cap. That's gonna force emissions to go down. Mm-hmm. Prices, permit prices will go up to reflect that. How you spend the money may lower the cost of meeting that cap, or may offset distributional impacts. So if we put a carbon price in place, or let's say a gas tax, right? If we raise the gas tax whatever amount, and we took all the revenue that was raised and we gave every American a lump sum refund check in the mail, people would respond and they would use less gasoline, and that would, for the most part, offset the distributional impact, because you were getting not a rebate of how much gasoline you consume, but a lump sum that you could spend on anything you wanted. You would still have the same incentive to reduce consumption, but that could offset some of the distributional impacts. And I think that's pretty important. I mean, there's a lot of people propose a wires charge, so every American pays a little bit more on their electricity bill to help fund whatever technology people want. There's a dedicated source of revenue. I'm not saying that's a terrible idea, but it's a flat tax. I mean, it's every household paying a certain amount, and that hits low-income people more than it hits high-income people. So I think that this issue of what the distributional impact would be of a carbon price is actually really important, and it doesn't always get as much attention on both sides of the debate. So I think it should.
So could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah,
so
sure.
I guess then, coming at this, since I'm a PhD student in sociology, and I like to think about social complexities, it seems like I'm looking at things like the Stern Report, and there's a whole suite of arguments which are made, which is along the lines of okay, it would cost some tiny fraction of GDP growth if you compare the likely cost of climate change to the cost of mitigating it. But this has been going on for 10 years. You've had these kinds of arguments. And so it does, we were talking about this earlier in the seminar, it seems kind of implausible to feel that there are all these win-win options out there that we just keep not hitting, that maybe the explanation for that is that the kinds of changes that would be required are in some ways socially more profound than we're willing to accept, because the kind of distributional issues you're talking about it wasn't easy in healthcare to try to, 20 states have rejected distributional measures around Medicaid. So, could it be that the climate world is going to have to start thinking in much broader terms about the kind of social changes associated with something that seems as simple as just a price on carbon, basically? What seems like a very simple, straightforward policy inevitably entails a whole bunch of other questions that we just haven't talked that much about.
I think I need to think more about the question. I mean, I think I probably think too simplistically about it. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but in some sense, it's also not that complicated. We're emitting too much of something in the air that's hurting us. And so we should set a limit on how much of that thing we can put in the air. And then let people in the economy figure out if you can, who should reduce, if I can reduce it more cheaply than you can, but let them figure it out. But fundamentally, that's the problem. So I don't want to make it too much more complicated because it's already complicated enough to try to solve. Like any tax policy, tax policy fundamentally is about our social values, what we care about, and who bears the burden of funding, the obligations and promises we've made to one another. So we need to think about who's going to bear the cost of this and whether there's a way to offset it. But maybe there's a way to keep those things separate so we can try to address the environmental externality in a way that we think is most cost effective. Because if we start to put lots of other policies in place, maybe you reduce emissions, maybe you don't. If you do, maybe you end up spending a lot more to do it. And then you need to think about where that comes from. So if we put other policies in place that make it much more costly to meet our carbon, target, where do those costs get distributed in the economy? So I think we could kind of try to focus on those two things and just make sure we don't lose sight of the distributional one.
All right, thanks.
I'm curious, I think in the article you wrote for the Democracy Journal, you wrote that you thought that the natural gas boom could create a lot of new jobs and sort of help build the economy. I've been thinking a lot about sort of following what's happening in Detroit over the last couple of years, and since I've been living in the Midwest, kind of seeing places like Gary, Indiana, and other sort of mining and coal boom towns in Illinois. Do you think that or when it comes to making policy, do you think about, with Detroit now setting such a precedent for what could go wrong in a city, do you anticipate that sort of setting a cap and trying to eliminate carbon emissions and thereby kind of having a huge effect on towns that run on coal exportation? Do you think, is that something that comes up in policy a lot, or is it kind of an elephant in the room, or?
Yeah, no, it's really important. First, I don't want to overstate the job creation impact. I think sometimes that's overstated. So you sort of hear rhetoric where we can, the U.S. economy can be run based on natural gas jobs or, the manufacturing boom. And so there's some rhetoric, overheated rhetoric sometimes about how much increase in shale gas or tight oil production can sort of power the U.S. economy. If you look at the data on the manufacturing sector, you can see that for a very small piece of the manufacturing sector, energy prices matter a lot. And so low natural gas prices will make a big difference for chemicals or for plastics. But notwithstanding, the graduate, we're not all going to be making plastics, right? So there's only so many people in the country who can make plastics. And
what about 3D printing, though? Is that
so? But still, increased production does have economic benefits. It does create jobs. It does create jobs. We just shouldn't overstate it. In terms of what you're talking about, which is there were winners and losers from climate policy, to be sure, and that's a little bit we were talking about before with distributional impacts of who faces the cost. But also, if we shift away, if we're shifting away from the use of coal, maybe we export some of it, maybe we don't. But that has an impact, and that's happening already structurally. We're seeing that not from policy, but just because the outlook for coal is not very strong in the U.S., so some of those places are already being hit. And I think it's really important that we, think as a policy matter about how to offset those impacts, how to make sure that we have, these are not terribly satisfying answers sometimes, but it's important to have transition programs and retraining programs. We think about areas where a lot of coal was developed, where maybe shale gas can also be developed, and some skills can shift. And, the president in his climate speech 2 weeks ago also included, I think it was $8 billion for investment in advanced coal technology. If you look at the IEA modeling, some people think carbon capture and storage is real, some people don't. But if you look at the amount of inexpensive fossil fuels that exist in the world, the idea that at some point, to be serious about getting to an 80% reduction, we're going to have to figure out some technology to capture emissions and store them, and fossil fuels will still play a role, even in a low-carbon economy, seems to me plausible. I don't know if it's I don't know to what scale, but it is certainly plausible, and there may be ways that fossil fuel production will continue down the road. But to the extent it doesn't, and there are winners and losers, which there are already being, it's really important for us to focus and do a better job than we have in the past on helping winners compensate losers and helping people transition, which is hard.
Hi, thank you very much for joining us. I just have a quick question. I don't know how feasible this is, but if we were to implement something like a carbon tax, tax and dividend, cap and trade, whatever you call it, and you reduce the demand of coal or other fossil fuels, one thing I was thinking is if it's an action that's implemented in one country, might we run the risk of actually decreasing the price and actually increasing energy consumption in other countries, thus offsetting the benefits that are accrued in the one country? Is that something that's been...
No, I mean, that's in a lot of the modeling when you look at leakage. Leakage is defined in different ways, but one of the impacts of reducing, I mean, if you look, for example, at the fuel economy rule, it's not just carbon tax, right? If we double fuel economy standards and we sharply depress U.S. demand for oil,
Right.
we lower world oil prices and we increase demand for oil somewhere else. And so that is a real economic effect. And that's why I still think on net you have a benefit in terms of reducing emissions. It's not totally offset, but that is an important, offsetting effect. And that's why ultimately climate change, because we see the growth is coming from non-OECD countries, because there are leakage effects, because people can relocate, industry can produce in one place rather than another. It does require a coordinated global solution. That's what makes it such a hard problem to solve.
I'm curious about what you said about it being a net beneficial effect. What makes you say that?
I don't think I'd have to sit down and sort of do some back of the envelope numbers, so I don't want to commit to that on camera or whatever. But I think, you need to look at sort of the elasticity of demand for what we think it is in other parts of the world. I would think that the emissions benefit of reducing consumption would not be entirely offset. So in order for it to be entirely offset, global demand for oil would need to stay at what it is. And the reduction, if we cut U.S. demand from 18.5 million barrels a day to 8.5 million barrels a day, the price effect is such that the rest of the world is consuming 10 million barrels a day more, so global consumption stays the same. That I don't think that is what a lot of the modeling to date of policy shows would be the case, and I don't think it would be what would happen. But we can look at it. I mean, it's an answerable question.
Okay. One other question is you talked about it being, in order to have such policy to be made, there needs to be a better public understanding of the issue and of the social costs associated with the issue, if I'm not mistaken. To what extent do you think it's a problem of the public having an understanding of the issue versus the policymakers, the legislature having an understanding of the issue?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I think people are at the policy level well aware of the scientific literature. The UNFCCC tries to help capture it in simple ways that policymakers can understand. That's important in all areas, not just climate science, but for people who are really deep in the weeds of a certain subject or science to help communicate their findings and their understanding of the problem to the public or policymakers. There's obviously there's some disagreement about exactly what it would mean for us to reach a certain part per million concentration and what the actual impacts would be. So I don't know if it's so much like policymakers don't understand it. I think they're aware of all the analysis. I think certainly in this administration, I don't speak for the administration anymore, but I think people take it very seriously and understand how important this is to future generations. Part of it is also just there's lots of competing priorities, and there's always like 5 crises every day, and sort of that's part of the challenge too, is just making sure that things stay elevated. So you're thinking about the latest report on climate impacts, but you're also kind of dealing with 5 other things at any one time. So that may be part of the challenge, but I don't know. I think it's probably helpful for the public and for policymakers to sort of help people understand, what climate impacts will be, and to keep those in the front of people's mind too.
Thank you.
Actually, on the idea of competing priorities, I was struck while watching the climate speech almost a month ago that it was planned the last week of the Supreme Court decisions. And I was just wondering if you had any comments on why that would be, because in some way it seemed he was appeasing a certain part of the electorate, but also it was very easy to sweep that whole speech under the rug because it came the day after the Voting Rights Act and the same day as the Prop 8 decision. I mean, it doesn't really seem like a good PR strategy if you're trying to get the maximum effect.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't know the answer. I don't know what went into scheduling it. Those things tend to get not scheduled the day of. So, I mean, I don't think anyone knew exactly when the Supreme Court was going to decide those things.
Well, I mean, it was the last week.
Yeah, so you could have guessed that there was a decent likelihood that they would decide some of their more controversial decisions on the last day. But I don't know. I mean, obviously the president's schedule is really complicated, and there's a lot of factors that go into figuring out when he has the ability to kind of give a speech on a certain topic. So I don't know what the thinking was and to what extent that was factored in or not.
Yeah, is there a lot of conversation about how best to kind of drum up the most kind of energy around whether revealing a new policy or some legislation, or is it more kind of a practical thing?
Well, it's both. I mean, you want to. I mean, it's practical considerations around scheduling and what works, and maybe he has a foreign trip or something like that. But obviously, we're trying to make sure that we keep people focused on. I don't want to say our. It sounds like I'm still there. The administration's trying to keep people focused on their priorities. And it's not just the president. I mean, if you were to count up the number of times that, Lisa Jackson or Stephen Chu or John Holdren or people were out, and Ken Salazar at the Interior Department were out speaking about climate change, traveling around the country, meeting with people, doing events. It's a huge list. Obviously, the president gets more attention, but no. I mean, I think people we're trying to keep the focus on the administration's priorities, and there are lots of priorities, but this is was one really important one.
Okay. Tim?
Is there any more questions from the audience? Then I'll have a final one.
Thank you very much, Professor. I had only one question. In the short and medium term, what might be your assessment of the seriousness of the Chinese determination to go ahead and to give a green light for a serious shale production in China against the backdrop of really precarious situation with the water resources in China, that are required, and potential serious ecological impact of it on the one hand, and on the other hand against the backdrop of the very nice offers that Russia is making with regard to the natural gas offers, either via pipeline or LNG. It's extremely affordable prices, and plenty of other geopolitical implications, very positive for China. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I don't know if I'd call the Russian prices very affordable, but it is. I was just, as I said. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a strong. And I think they just signed a long-term deal, and I don't think the price has been determined yet, so that's going to be a source of tough negotiation. I was just there 2 weeks ago, as I said, and talked to a lot of people about the outlook for shale development in China. And there's a broad consensus that, as there is, I think, among many of the companies here, that shale is still 10 or 20 years off in China, which is surprising in some ways, right? I mean, you sort of hear a laundry list of reasons why that is, because the geology is not as productive, because there's not the same built-out storage and pipeline infrastructure that we had here, because water resources are more scarce, part of which I understand. I mean, it's also true that this is a country that can build out a high-speed rail line pretty quickly when it makes it a priority. And I have some thoughts about why it'll take as long there. I don't think it's the same nature of, there's just 2 or 3 state-owned companies. There's not the same real competition that there was here. There's not private land ownership and mineral rights. So I do think it'll be challenging. The water issue you identify as a really important one, both water quality, because of the potential if you don't do this correctly, I think it can be done correctly, but if you don't do it correctly, to really have impacts on water quality, and also the water needs, the amount of water that's used to frack. I think technology is improving, so the amount of water per well is declining. I was on a panel recently with the head of water for Schlumberger. We were talking about the Sichuan Basin or the Tarim Basin, or parts of China that are that don't have fresh water resources. And he said they figured out how to frack with subsurface saline water, that they can drill a well, pull up saline water. It's more costly. It needs to be treated a little bit differently, but that actually would change the dynamic, because you'd suddenly have a lot of water you could use that wouldn't compete with drinking water. So I think technology might help companies figure out how to do that, particularly if it is as far out as people think it is. I think when you look at the needs, the energy needs of that country, how dramatic they are, how much they're going to grow, what the air quality concerns in that country are, I think helping China develop the capacity to produce shale gas sooner rather than later would help. Yeah. So would be helpful. And then, as you said, the deals they're signing with Russia are, I think, really fascinating. The signal of Russia liberalizing its LNG export monopoly, allowing CNPC to take a 20% stake in Novatek's Yamal LNG plant, and China is clearly forming very close ties with the Russians to make sure they have the natural gas supply that they need, because it's going to grow so sharply. But as you saw in the chart I put up, that's still dwarfed by the amount of coal that they're going to produce domestically and consume.
But in fact, Professor Ward, they already start a huge amount, this
coal bed methane, yeah.
It's part of the shale.
Yeah.
So we've generated kind of a traditional wrap-up question given for this late hour, especially for people with new institutes, to ask you, tell us more about your institute. But especially I'm interested in the three I's that I try to promote: the intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and international dimensions. And I know your mission is to bring together Wall Street and Washington and elite economic thinking. But where's the role for the world conversation, and especially the intergenerational?
Yeah, and it's not, I wouldn't say just like Wall Street and Washington, although, I mean, I think why I got excited that SIPA was creating this policy center, and why I left the White House to run it, was because of how important I thought it was for policymakers to understand better how the energy landscape is changing, how the unconventional oil and gas boom is changing, how renewable costs are coming down, what the impacts of climate are, really across the board, both domestic and global. And when you're in government, new issues sort of come on your desk. I mean, all of a sudden, and so it's like all of us. In my democracy article, I sort of flagged maybe the fact that we've gone from 0 to 1 million barrels a day almost overnight for moving crude oil by rail might be something we want to take a look at. And then tragically, an accident happened in Canada a few weeks ago, and I don't know if there's a problem with regulations or not, but it's certainly something worth looking carefully at. Lots of other changes that sort of suddenly, whether we should export oil, whether we should export gas, these kind of things come up. And so you sort of say, well, there's a lot of claims being made on both sides. How do I sort through them? How do I know what's true and what's not? Particularly in D.C., there's a lot of studies funded by one industry group or another, and you sort of take them with a grain of salt. So what we're hoping to do is really sort of become a place that's seen as objective, trusted source of analysis to help policymakers understand how the energy landscape is changing, particularly for those policy questions that really require a good understanding of how energy markets work, how the energy finance community works, insights that we can draw on from our base here in New York, where there's a lot of people who spend their time studying these things, and both a local perspective. I mean, the mayor recently released a resilience report for New York City, and in 2 areas called out the center to help implement certain recommendations and do some convening and analysis, and also really a global perspective. And we'll be working in Latin America to help understand the potential for policy changes to produce resources. We'll be working in China on I brought David Sandalo, who was the number 3 official of the U.S. Energy Department, as a fellow at the center now when he left the Energy Department, and he's looking a lot at the political economy of shale, which we were just talking about in China. Nobuo Tanaka, who's the former head of the International Energy Agency, is a fellow at the center, and he's going to be looking a lot at the future of nuclear power. He is based in Tokyo, so that's a particular interest to Japanese officials now. And we're going to be doing work in Africa, both on resource potential, hydrocarbon, renewable, and also energy access. How to build on what the president announced in Africa a few weeks ago and expand energy access for people in Africa. So it's a broad agenda, it's an ambitious one, and we're going to try to work on a lot of things that are top of mind for policymakers, hopefully cutting edge in terms of things people are really struggling with and thinking about now, and where better analysis would really help inform the policy debate.
Can I ask one question we've never asked anybody before, which is, how does being the son and the grandson of a gas station owner inform the way you think about energy and the way you articulate that.
I thought it was going to be the last question from like inside the actor studio, that your favorite curse word. And
no, you should throw that in fracking, obviously, right? But, you know.
I don't know that it does. I mean, so I think I said earlier before the speech when we were meeting downstairs that I first sort of got a deep interest in energy when I did a master's degree in Middle East politics, and you can't really study the Middle East without politics. And I did that, I think I was driven to do that because my mother immigrated to New York from the Middle East in the late 50s when Nasser sort of forced most of the Jews to leave Egypt. She came over. And so it was that combination, I think, that kind of led to an interest in energy. So I don't know how much, if any, it really affected it. It was just an interest in where energy comes from initially, which is kind of where my mom is from in the Middle East, although not quite Egypt, but the region, and then where it's all the way down to where it's used and dispensed and consumed, and that whole process, which often is mostly invisible to most of us, is just is deeply interesting to me for economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons, and for environmental and climate reasons. I mean, we've talked about those here, but again, what makes this issue so interesting to me to work on is that it forces you to combine kind of an understanding of all of those things. And when I was in the White House, it was kind of it was a little unique but fun that I had the chance to work at the Council on Environmental Quality. I also worked at the National Economic Council, and then I moved to the National Security Council. And so I got to work in each of the offices in the White House with an equity in each of those different areas. And that really made it a sort of rewarding experience to help enrich the way I think about the issue from different perspectives.
Okay. Thank you so much. And let me again welcome you to Columbia, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Jason.
Thanks for having me.